célébrer ça avec des doctorants qui ont eu l'occasion de voir leur thèse mise en bande dessinée. Et la première de ces doctorantes, c'est Arpi, dans ce sens-là, Arpi, voilà, qui est avec nous, musique un peu forte. On me dit que la musique est forte, alors je baisse la musique, voilà. C'est Arpi qui est avec nous, qui nous vient d'Arménie. Voilà, Arpi est arménienne, et donc Arpi préfère parler en anglais, parce que le français est une langue particulièrement compliquée, et on est tous d'accord avec ça, voilà. Hein. On rappelle que dans le mot oiseau, il y a presque toutes les voyelles, et il n'y en a aucune qui se prononce comme elle est censée se prononcer. Et donc, la suite de cette interview va être en anglais. Voilà. Si jamais vous ne comprenez pas un truc, vous le dites dans le chat, je répète en français, ça ne me dérange pas, je fais le traducteur. De toute façon, j'ai toutes les casquettes. Et maintenant que tout ça c'est dit, I'm going to switch back to English so that we can talk and we can talk properly. Hello, Arpi.
Hello.
One more thing. J'ai remarqué, peut-être que parfois le son va avoir l'air de doubler, c'est momentané, ça va passer, je pense qu'il y a un petit souci avec le logiciel que j'utilise, je vais régler ça pour la prochaine fois, désolé à tout le monde. There's some sort of doubling sound sometimes, it's just to warn everybody. So there's a lot of people with us who say salut, who say hello Arpi. So Arpi, I hope you're well. We pretend, yeah? Okay.
I'm well.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. And I'm warning everybody, my English is not going to be perfect, so that we're on the same page.
Being shy.
So I'm gonna go straight for it. Can you talk about yourself, your studies here abroad, and how in the end you chose architecture as a way of earning a living?
Okay, that's really an existential question, but here we go. I mean, first choosing architecture as a profession wasn't to say that architecture was my first choice. It's not true. It was kind of accidental. I sort of fell into architecture studies when I was just graduating school, and I had different plans. I wanted to be an artist, but then, one thing after another, I ended up in architectural school. But then I really sort of, during my studies, fell in love with the profession and realized, no, I'm really an architect. So the profession more or less found me.
Okay.
I found it. And yeah, it was a love story. So then in Armenia, I started doing my bachelor's in Yerevan State Polytechnical University. Back then it was called Polytechnical. Now it's National University of Architecture and Construction. So they, over the years, both the structure and the naming kind of changed. And after my bachelor's, 4 years of bachelor's I did in Armenia, I went to Germany to continue my studies in a city called Dessau. And the school was called, is called Dessau International School of Architecture, where I spent another 2 years of studying architecture. And then a couple of years trying to enter the practice of architecture, both as a freelance architect and working a little bit in architectural offices. I can't say that I spent a lot of time in an architectural office, so I have some experience with what it's like to be a practicing architect. And then, this was a period after graduating my master's, for a couple of years where I was testing things. I was trying to understand what is the direction I would like to take. Not always I would end up in architectural firms or architectural jobs. And then after a while, I decided it's time to do a PhD in architecture. And this is how I ended up sort of in the city of Nantes, because back then a professor from Germany who recommended his kind of his friend and colleague. His colleague became later my supervisor, who is my supervisor now, Laurent Lescope. And we started working together for a while before the PhD to sort of form the general idea.
And voila. So there was some time between your master's degree and your PhD in architecture. In other scientific disciplines, usually you do the master's degree and right after you go for the PhD. Did you choose to wait between the master's and the PhD, or is it an architecture thing to have a long pause between master's and PhD?
I would say normally it is not like in other disciplines, not like in hard science when you absolutely have to have a PhD in order to proceed with your career. With architects, some of the greatest architects don't even have architectural formal education. Sometimes even, going straight away to a PhD in architecture can be an obstacle rather than an advantage in a professional field. In my experience, some offices, for instance, they prefer to have students right after graduating their masters to kind of try to teach them, try to mold them into what they need in the office. In general, formal education in architecture and architectural practice are very different, and it's normal because in academia you don't have the real world factors like time and the money and the technical restrictions and the clients and so on, which I think it is the way it should be. And then once you graduate, you start relearning things in an office. Whereas if you choose to become an academic, you go back into the academia, and this is the world of research now is your home. So in terms of whether you have to do a PhD right after the master's, not at all. For architects,
okay.
It's not mandatory.
Okay. And so how come you chose, so how come you went from the master's degree, from being an architect, a profession architect, to the PhD? Was it really this contact with your professor that you're still working with, or was there a will from you to upgrade your skill?
I think after a while of sort of searching what I want to do in both in the field and trying little things here and there and going a little bit outside of my field, I had a feeling that I need to explore a little more my general position on the profession of architect. And it's very hard to do when you're sort of involved in day-to-day life of a practicing architect, and you're dealing with those practical, very kind of immediate problems. So I would say in some way I needed the headspace and the time and the quiet to think what is it I actually want to do, or maybe what are the problems I would like to try and solve in terms of the general positioning in the profession. And I started looking for options before even having a contact with my professor, with my supervisor. So I started looking for universities, looking for programs, and bit by bit was led to where I am now.
Usually for the past interviews that I did, there was a strong connection between the master's degree and the PhD. For friends who are in physics or in chemistry, what they did during the last 6 months of their master's degree was basically the beginning of their PhD thesis. So is there a link between what you did during your master's degree and what you're doing now, or is it something completely new for you?
Maybe yes and no. No direct link, I would say. because again, to imagine what architects do in their bachelor's and in the masters is we try to design things, as many things as we can. We try to learn about the profession of architecture, architectural theory, history. Try to mm, kind of experiment with as many topics as we can, from design little houses to airports. To try to cover a big range of things. So of course, you can have some specific directions towards the end when you're doing your master's diploma and so on. But the more you experiment, the more you try, the better. Because this is the only time actually that you're allowed to do that freely. When you exit the school, you're then going to be in a very strict regime, very strict environment where you have to design specific things under specific conditions. So in this way, no, it's not directly linked. But I think starting from bachelor's, then continuing to masters, I started noticing some things which I would like to be fixed, maybe, which were a bit problematic for me during the process of designing and thinking about architecture. And I thought, oh well, maybe PhD is one of a place to try to tackle those questions. We can talk about this.
But I want all the details. All of them.
Okay, I'll try to be short because it's a big topic. But imagine, let's maybe start from the beginning. A student goes into architecture school, nothing about architecture. Maybe some architecture schools, they demand an entrance exam, which is normally, in our case, it was mathematics. It was kind of a technical, three-dimensional drawing exercise to check if you can think in 3D, if you can actually imagine space and imagine form. And then you do an academic drawing. So you're more or less, this stereotypical, the biggest stereotype about the architect is that they're good with math, and they are good with drawings. So that's why kind of you enter into university having some knowledge about these domains, but not much more. First couple years, they start teaching you not to design specific buildings or specific spaces, but how to actually think as an architect and see as an architect. And for instance, they teach you, again, academic drawing, not for the purpose of being perfect at drawing a Greek statue, but for the purpose of seeing those small nuances in light and in texture and so on. So first 3 years is very heavy immersion into the architectural profession in terms of history, and in terms of theory, and in terms of technical things. You learn about construction, materials, and so on. So at this point, they're kind of preparing you to start designing a building. And then what happened in my experience, because in our school, first three years you were not allowed to use any digital tools, which for me was actually an advantage, because you could learn the fundamentals first and then kind of overlay the techniques over the fundamentals. So then after the third year, the students kind of divided themselves in two parts, and this was, I think, around 2010, 2011. So the digital tools were just emerging. They were maybe kind of already in use in the industry, but in schools not so much. So they were trying to kind of adopt the new CAD tools, and first was AutoCAD, and back then the 3ds Max became the whole rage. So then half of the school population decided to go in the direction when they really started heavily investing in architectural softwares and in renderings, because the hyper-realistic renderings became all the rage back then. And I think most of the students were in a hurry to adopt these tools because they thought they wouldn't get a job or something, they wouldn't be competitive without them. So for me, there was this kind of breaking point when the architectural visualization in terms of a rendering became kind of a value of its own, and the architecture and the design was left in the backdrop a little bit in the schools, at least in the minds of some students were very anxious to be a part of the new technological landscape. And bit by bit, I was following, the progression of this, not just in the academia, but also in the professional setting, where very quickly, I think, the visuals took over the design. This is not to say that this is the first time in history that technology sort of creates a large mainstream kind of copies of copies of copies. But I think at one point it became kind of the value of design was confused with the nice image that the architect was producing. And back then, now these things are much easier to do, especially with artificial intelligence. But back then, it was very labor-intensive process to produce a realistic rendering, and it was a real kind of another type of knowledge that an architect had to learn and relearn every time they entered an office, because each office used a different software, and so was becoming very hard to combine being an architect in its core sense, and trying to also manage to be a kind of a visual artist for architecture. So I think later on in my PhD, I sort of thought, what if this is something that could be solved? What if the architect doesn't have to spend so much time in those renderings, could achieve the same type of result? And what if that process can be optimized, and you could just focus on the design?
And so, before we delve further inside your core research, finding the thesis, was it something hard, easy? Were you alone or accompanied? Did you have to go through a specific things like interviews, or in France sometimes you can have a contest, but I don't have a word for concours. It's like a contest, but it's not a contest. It's a it's an examination of students. Or was it quite straightforward, and this subject was for you, designed for you and by you, and it was something quite easy, or not?
Okay, so to my knowledge, there are two general systems. One, as you say, there are certain laboratories within certain institutions. They're either attached to the universities or attached to a larger research unit. It depends. Sometimes they're attached to a private kind of company who is funding the research in a certain direction. So this means whatever PhD you're trying to do is going to be in that direction. This is a part of the kind of a PhD community that the topic is set, and you're just applying for that topic. And then I think there is the second, which is my case as well, where you have a lab which allows for a lot of wiggle room, let's call it that. And this gives you enough freedom to formulate your topic. I think in the beginning it's always challenging because you start very large. And in this case, your professor, your supervisor, he brings it down to manageable proportions, because in my case, I mean, he knew that it's too big and too abstract and too global, needed to be more concrete. So what we did was, after having the initial introductions with my supervisor started working together on forming the PhD proposal. So we didn't have kind of a formal exam to get in, which I know because I've tried to do this with other universities as well. In some cases, they require certain, exams and certain things to be provided. But in this case, what we had to do was write the PhD proposal with my professor, and it took us a little while to refine it, to bring it to a scientific format. And then you try to look for your funding. Again, sometimes your lab has already attached itself to some kind of unit who has the funding and is funding the lab itself. Sometimes either each professor or each PhD student needs to find their own funding and kind of organize all of this. In my case, I think, it was the hardest part to find find the funding. If you're in a lab that has the kind of the financing, it's fine. You just pass the exams and you get in. But in our case, you need to kind of try to see where your topic can be useful, who can pay for it, for you to start your research.
Okay. I'm looking at the questions that have already been answered. So now we're gonna get into it. So it's now a running gag for the Sensarium. It's the reading of the thesis title, because it's always very long with words that no one gets and association of words that no one gets either. So for your case, your thesis title is Generative Digital Tools Applied to Architecture Atmospheres Put to the Test by the Emergence of AI, Artificial Intelligence. So, first of all, what does it all mean?
That's a good one. I wish I could tell you, but okay. Let's maybe again start to tackle it bit by bit. I think, well, first of all, didn't start like that. Normally, when you start a PhD, you kind of decide on a title, and then every year you feel the need of changing it. So this is my case exactly. Because our lab here in the ENSA Nantes, this is the architectural school of the city of Nantes. The lab itself is called Créneau, and kind of the scope of research in our lab, because it deals with not just urbanity but also the ambiances, and the scope of the lab itself is wide enough for the PhD students to be able to formulate their own topic inside the kind of a big cap of the lab. I think first years of the PhD were very different from what it is now and where we arrived eventually, because in the beginning there was no experimentation with the AI, maybe a little bit because it was just starting and emerging. But the first years we started experimenting a lot with kind of the integration of the digital technologies into the processes of architecture. But then bit by bit, it changed and it evolved. So I think this is kind of a standard process for the PhD thesis. Well, yeah. To be fair, I think where it all starts taking shape is exactly this idea of where would you place the architect as a professional, and where would you place architecture as a profession in today's landscape, in today's world? So this was the big question. How does the profession of architecture change, and how do architects change, or should they?
And so, is there a lot of the question, kind of the same question there are for illustrators, because some people are saying that, well, now we don't need illustrators anymore because we have AI that can make 1,000 pictures the second. So is the kind of the same questioning applying for architecture, or are there still aspects of it that are really about what can really be done, and AI is just going crazy for weird buildings that can sustain themselves magically?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Let's go back a little bit again. Since the emergence of the digital technologies, I think that was quite long ago, officially 2009, but
Mm-hmm.
even before that, little by little, the architects started to adopt these tools, and then after a while, when the level of productivity of the machines became much higher, there's kind of again the split. And I'm always bringing the example of the students because the young people and the young professionals are kind of the first to adopt
Mm-hmm.
the new technologies, and then automatically what I watched was my peers and my colleagues put themselves in opposition with the generation who was
Mm-hmm.
rejecting the tools, stating that kind of the handmade architecture, not just architecture, just the hand drawn line has
Mm-hmm.
has a value of its own. What I think is the core of the confusion. That's why I mentioned that first 3 years we didn't use any digital tools, and to me it was an advantage. Is exactly this kind of is in the center of this opposition of, let's call
Mm-hmm.
it, the old and the new, if we're allowed to use such broad terms. Every time there is this wave of new technology, and people who adopt it first put themselves immediately in opposition with the old techniques and with the old
Mm-hmm.
kind of patterns. But I think what happened here is most of the people are confusing the ideological opposition with
Mm-hmm.
the technical opposition. So in terms of, in order to be in order to reject the patterns of the past, that needs to be done on the level of the ideas, not on the level of the techniques. So in this case, it doesn't matter if you're drawing the line with AutoCAD or
Mm-hmm.
ArchiCAD or with AI. What's 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 different in on the level of the idea? And uh, this is partially, I think, happening in architecture because there was historically, after the big architectural projects, the modernist project and then the postmodern project, the deconstructivist project and so on, the regionalist project, all of them were kind of always referencing something from the past and trying to pinpoint what is the core of
Mm-hmm.
the opposition with the past. With the digital architecture, I feel that there's still a gap between, the
Mm-hmm.
past and the future. I I feel that the digital architecture is not formed yet as a full
Mm-hmm.
theory of its own and cannot
Mm-hmm.
stand on its own for now. This is why we are having these troubles as architects trying to say, oh well, will architects using AI produce same quality of architecture and so on? But for me, that's not the debate. The debate is what is the architectural project
Mm-hmm.
of our century. And when we figure that out, it wouldn't matter if you're creating it with AI or with creating it with, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
any other technology. So I guess this is something that anyone stepping not just into a field of architecture, but also in academia and doing a PhD needs to pay attention to. Is
Mm-hmm.
this a real struggle?
Mm-hmm.
AI or no AI? Is that the real, or are we missing something
Okay.
else? I don't know if I did too much, but you tell me
Well,
if I go into a.
I'm loving everything that's happening. Um, so, one of the people who are watching us tonight is one of the people I interviewed before. It's a Theo, who did his PhD in chemistry. And when people say, I'm doing a thesis in chemistry, we can picture in our mind what they're doing. We picture them with white coats, and they have little glass bottles, and they're mixing stuff, and it goes booms, and this is chemistry. And so for a hard science thesis, we can picture really easily what they do. They read what has been done, they try to do something new, and then they write why they couldn't do something new, because it's the way of the PhD. But for architecture, the reading part, I guess you did it too. The writing part, you're about to do it, as we've discussed just before the beginning of the stream. But for the experimenting part, how do you do to answer this question? Do you go to other architects and ask them how they do their designs? Or do you yourself do designs to test various AIs, no AIs, etc.? How do you perform experiments to find an answer to your question?
Actually, both. So what we normally do is there are two approaches. Either we set up a kind of a test group. Normally, it is either a group of students, or if we're trying to test it in a professional setting in terms of kind of an outside academic project, we try to find an actual use case with an office and try to tell them, okay, here is where we can help you with this. And then in terms of that project, we try to test our own ideas, if the office or if that unit is open to this. Not always it's an architecture office. For instance, we had some projects with city halls in Nantes and in Andres. So it's a city nearby very near to Nantes. So either it is a project that comes outside of the lab, has some kind of objective, where inside of that objective we're trying to test our own things, our own questions. Or we just work with a group of students where we give them a kind of a strictly formulated project, and we are expecting some type of result which later we can evaluate. So these are two types of experiments. And then in cases where we cannot do it, with the help of the external projects, we model it ourselves. So we try to we create either, because my topic is very much related to kind of this digital translation of architectural media into architectural visuals. I can easily set up an experiment digitally.
Okay, so various ways, but you can still make experiments in the old ways. So you have to take a test group and demonstrate concepts. Okay.
In that sense, it's very similar to the general kind of practices of a scientific domain. There's, of course, it depends on the PhD. It depends on the topic. It can be purely theoretical. In architecture, it can be related more to the history and the theory, and be related to that part. In that case, maybe you don't need that many experiments. You don't need experiments at all. You're just, building up on the basis of the architectural knowledge that already exists, and you're suggesting a new theory. But in my case, because it's more related to a practical application of a method, it is experimental.
Sometimes there are subjects that interest 4 people on the entire planet, and so it's really hard to find bibliography, so work that has been done before, to have a starting point and not going from scratch to do your own research. So regarding to your thesis, have there already been a lot of research on the context of AI in architecture, or would you say that you are doing this from scratch and you are the world expert on emerging AI in architecture?
No, I don't think I'm a world expert in the emergence of AI in anything. I don't think because in past couple of years the AI has
Mm-hmm.
accelerated with such a speed. I am not sure that there's, you know, it's gonna be very hard to find a topic which is
Yeah.
you'll be the kind of the absolute knowledge carrier of that topic. Maybe I don't know. I don't want to be ignorant in this to say that novelty in science is gonna get harder and harder to achieve. But I feel that there's so much, so many texts, so many things coming up, including the use of AI in architecture. Maybe not there are not so many practical applications, but people started doing that, and
Mm-hmm.
it's speeding up. So I guess my challenge at the moment is finding out my very narrow strip of expertise, or you know, what is it that I have advantage in, and just try to stay in that very narrow strip.
Okay. So we said that this is your third year in thesis, if I'm not wrong. In hard sciences, PhD theses are 3 years. In history or literature, it can be longer. It can be 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years of PhD. In architecture, in your case, is it 3 years, longer, shorter? Well, not shorter, but is it longer than that, or will it end by the third year?
Mm, it should end officially by third year. So this is kind of 3 years is the official time frame that we get for a PhD in our lab, particularly. But I know cases, and I think whenever you're a bit late and you're in the process of writing and you feel that it's taking a bit longer, it's not the case when they just, you know, kind of force you to give it up right now and right here. You normally have an opportunity to extend it for a little while. I have colleagues who worked on their PhD for 4 years, 5 years sometimes. So it really depends on the project. Sometimes you start a project and then second year you realize it's much bigger than you thought. So it's gonna take
Okay.
you longer. And I think it's good that you're allowed to stay a bit more if you need. Otherwise, you would be very kind of anxious to just cut it short. And
So this is your third year, so it means that you've done already a lot of reading, a lot of experimenting, and you're about to do a lot of writing. Have you started writing, or are you going to?
I
Ah,
started with the titles of the chapters. So as my supervisor says, it's the hardest part
yeah.
to put the structure in place. That's the current struggle. But yeah, this is the year where I need to start writing heavily and also reading, because first 2 years was more experimental. First year was really an open-ended experimentation kind of phase. Second year as well, you know, we had projects and courses with the students, you know, this kind of experiments with small groups. And now is the time not only to write, but also bring everything together, to summarize all the thoughts, to throw away everything that is not relevant, and try to limit it to a
Okay.
manageable amount of knowledge
You
for
you are
to
being
finish the
supported by the chat,
PhD.
who tells me it's what a stressful question I just asked. Apparently, you have supporters in the chat.
No, yeah, it's procrastination all the way. You open a white page and you start
Uh,
panicking immediately.
yeah, in France, we call it the syndrome de la page blanche, the white page syndrome, because you have it and you like, I don't know
Yeah.
what to write, I don't know what to say. So how did your thesis go? Did everything went well? The reading, the experimenting, were you well accepted in your laboratory, or was it something complicated? Because as we've said at the beginning of the interview, you're from Armenia, so it means, I guess, that your family lives in Armenia. Is the distance something that is complicated to live, or are you able to live your thesis the best way possible?
The distance is also, of course, complicated to sort of switch from one environment to another, and you know, you change your circle of friends and your family. This is challenging, especially in the beginning. You're, it's, but since you know, it's the second time that I'm doing this. I moved to Germany for my master's, and I already knew the drill. So
Okay.
you arrive in a country, first couple of months, you kind of adopt and try to figure out how to organize your life every day. And then once you're comfortable, you get into this space. The distance is always hard. Luckily, I think during the PhD I have more um, possibilities to travel. So we try to compensate, you know, trying to visit the family as much as we can. And in the lab, I mean, the experience was wonderful. I was welcomed immediately and was very warm welcome, and it's really I think, kind of an environment where they allow you to explore. You're not stressed to deliver a certain result or a certain direction. The projects that arrive, kind of, you're also able to choose. Is this relevant to my topic?
Okay, so we're having a problem. Can you still hear me or not? No, so we've lost Arpi for an unknown reason. So we're going to the technical issues. We'll be back in a moment. And we're back. I'm really glad that I have already made an issues layout for moments like this. What were ça m'a coupé. What were we saying? Yes, that the distance is complicated.
Yeah. So, but I mean, all of that is sort of bit by bit you get used to, and as I was saying in the lab, in this case, our lab allows for a lot of kind of creative freedom. You're able to choose not just the projects, not just direction of your thesis, but as you go, you kind of orient yourself more here and there, and it's quite nice.
So, during the PhD, you have many missions. You have to read, you have to experiment, you have to write, but sometimes you also have to write papers. You have to go to conferences abroad. You have to sometimes teach classes. So, did you do all of this or just some of this? Did you travel a lot for conferences? Did you teach a lot? And if so, to what level of students, masters, license? So how were you? How were your annex, your other missions as a PhD student?
Well, again, in our lab particularly, because I know from lab to lab it's a different experience, but in our case, all of that, you have some mandatory points that you need to fill out, and is one of them. I don't think also traveling abroad for conferences, maybe. I'm not sure if that's officially a point that you absolutely have to do. You have to, I know for sure that you have to complete certain, let's say, qualification tasks, courses, something like this. So that's as far as the mandatory part goes. In this case, I've done, not in the first year maybe, or if I recall correctly, it was the second semester of the first year I started teaching. We've done maybe one studio project. Well, studio, to give you a little context about what the architectural school looks like. You normally would have your classes, and you would have the studios where, along with the professors, students are doing the projects. Those studio projects take a semester or 2 semesters, depending whether the students are preparing for their master's diploma or they're just doing another studio project. So for the teaching, I took part in that, and then we are doing regularly, along with my supervisors, these 1 week short workshop projects when we have an intense 1 week of working. We introduce the topic in the beginning of the week, and then the students have to spend the entire week not only researching the topic but also producing something towards the end. So, which was quite nice. And then there's a third kind of variety of teaching as the students are preparing for their, and we're talking about master students, first year, second year master students. As the second year students are preparing for their thesis, they have also a lot of reading and a lot of writing to do. And I assist my professor as well in that domain in terms of meeting with the students, trying to see what the topic is and what is the progress, and to see if they need help with orientating themselves in the topic and so on. So that's the teaching part. The conferences and the travel abroad, I can't say that I've done many. We've done a paper for the Sigradi last year. This was in Barcelona. The conference was quite nice. It was the first one. I mean, in the beginning, when you're not used to the academic writing and you're not used to the whole paper publishing kind of situation, this can be a brain-racking moment to realize that no, writing the paper is not the same as writing any other text. You need to be accountable for every word and every term. So I think in the beginning I was really having a hard time to bring the paper to a level where it is now clean and can be submitted for the further processing. But then the conferences are really an amazing opportunity to expand your knowledge. Really love it. And then this year we're doing a cooperation with we're doing a paper with the university, the Polytechnico, now the National University of Architecture in Yerevan. And the conference is going to be very, very soon in November in Vienna. So again, each time we do a paper, it depends on who are we working with, who are the authors and so on, and what's the topic is going to be. This one, the upcoming one, it's a little bit away from whatever we've been doing before. Before, all the papers were more focused on kind of the analysis of the architectural design process with the integration of certain technology, whether it is a VR or AI. So we would do, let's say, an experiment with students. We would try to figure out how do they exactly use this type of technology, and what effect does that technology have on the process of designing in the early stages of design. when you're not making technical drawings to build things, but you're just exploring the design. So that was about that domain. And now this one that we're planning to present in Vienna, it's more about the long-term monitoring of land use in terms of monumental heritage observation, because we are now cooperating with the kind of Department of Monumental Heritage in inside the university, and we're trying to each of us are trying to ask the questions that is interesting for our own scientific work. So for them, the monitoring of monumental heritage is the key point, and for us is the application or the automation of this type of monitoring or processing of the large amount of visual data through the application of AI. Like, kind of, it's always I feel that most interesting projects come out of interesting cooperations. So I would say if you're writing an article or you're doing a project, really invest in searching for
finding good colleagues is always the hardest part. So during your thesis, have you met any particular difficulties? Was something at some point a real problem for you or for the continuation of your work? Or did it just all go very smoothly?
Luckily, it was really smooth. I know stories from my colleagues who get really stuck, get really depressed. I know this is a possibility. Having a PhD can be very hard mentally and physically. Luckily for me, it was really smooth. I mean, in the beginning, you get confused because you pile on a lot of things. You take too many directions, and you're not very assertive. You're not very you don't throw things away. But as you progress, you realize, oh, not every direction can be discussed, can be explored. So that I think the moment I started taking out things and putting them away, this took a lot of pressure from topic and from mentally as well. I'd say when you get stuck, it helps not to be there alone. Just go discuss it with someone. So having really an environment where you can discuss your topic, where you can share.
Okay. Well, I'm happy that it all goes smoothly because, of course, the difficulties can bring a good story, but it also means that the PhD student, well, when pretty depressed at some point, it's kind of the cliche for the PhD student to be depressed, sleeping 2 hours by night, having huge black pockets between below.
No, I mean that's coming for sure because I started writing, so there will be
coming.
black circles
it's
and
coming.
there will be 2 hours. It's coming. Yeah, it doesn't have to everyone who tries to start a PhD. You don't. It's not the rule, huh? You don't need to be depressed in order to be a PhD.
Yeah, of course.
Can be very very nice.
I've asked that. I'm reading my questions. So now you're doing a PhD in France. It's a CDD. It's a predetermined duration contract. So you know that at some point the contract will end. Hopefully, it will end with you having your PhD. Have you already thought about after the PhD? Will you go for a postdoc contract? Will you be a researcher in architecture, or will you go back to the profession of being an architect?
To be honest, I don't know what
Mhm.
will happen in short term after I graduate immediately. But in the long term, I would like to test uh, the hypotheses or the methodology that
Mhm.
we've been developing in my PhD in
Okay.
practice. And I think I don't know in which format that will eventually happen, but I would love to create kind of to translate that into a product or into a
Mhm.
platform that architects can use, which would sort of be a proof of concept. So whether it's going to be a startup or something else,
Okay.
we don't know yet. But like to I would like to turn this into kind of a practical tool for architects and for the students to also test whether the
Yeah, of
hypothesis
course.
is correct.
Of course. So, and I'm always really happy because this, I don't know if it's my questions or something, but it's almost 8 p.m. and I usually say that the interview lasts for an hour. So now we are at the part of the interview where we'll be taking questions from the chat. So the chat, le chat. If you have questions, si vous avez des questions, it's time to ask them. C'est le moment de les poser. And while we are waiting for the chat to write questions for you, Arpi, I'm going to ask you one question about architecture. Do you prefer art déco or art nouveau? Ah.
That's a trick question, and the answer is architecture is not about
Oh.
style. Both of those are styles. No, really. I mean, it's interesting. If
No,
we have a little
we have
time, let's
much time.
just talk about this. Imagine, imagine imagine you're an architect in times of Art Nouveau or Art Deco or let's
Mm-hmm.
say Gothic architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So even going back, at that very moment, you're not realizing that you're working
Mm.
in Art Deco or you're
Yeah.
working in Gothic style, right? Style is a historic fact. Only after that style has passed, now you be able to formulate it and you say, okay,
Okay.
this is this style and
Okay.
this is the other style. So when we say, do you prefer this or do you prefer that? It's a kind of a, there's no way of answering that without going, without, putting yourself back
Okay.
into that historic
Mm-hmm.
line of things.
I feel that this is a very architect answer to this question. But now that we have answered this question about Art Nouveau and Art Deco, and of course Art Nouveau is better. Uh, um,
No, I mean, there's nothing with having preference.
and I'm very biased because I love Art Nouveau. I love it. I love it. We have two questions from the same person. The first question is how long did it take between paper submission and acceptance? And the second question, which is linked to it, is and is it typical in your field of research?
Well, okay, in my personal experience, not more than maybe
Okay.
2 months, the entire process. One of them a bit longer, but it depends on
Mm-hmm.
where you're trying to publish. If you're publishing in a kind of in a minor scientific journal, normally they don't have so many submissions, so
Mm-hmm.
they take it really quickly. The process is you submit your abstract about a month later.
Mm-hmm.
They give you a response, sometimes even sooner, if you got accepted. And then they will give you an exact timeline when they're going to review, how much is it going to take. Normally, after the abstract, they will tell you, they will give you some comments. Even when it is accepted, they will tell you, okay, these and these things are ambiguous, so just, either change them or pay attention when you're submitting the full paper. Then after the submission of the paper, they will take another month, sometimes 2. Again, depends on which journal or which conference are you applying to. They will send you their comments. Sometimes the comments back and forth, but in my case we were lucky, so there were not so many corrections. I know people who were going back and forth with the reviewer for 6 months. Depends.
Okay,
So
between 2 and 6 months, you'd say. Okay.
Yes. If you're applying for a publication, just kind of pay attention on the timeline. Usually they are very very good with keeping the agenda. So when they say we'll review it in 2 months, normally that's what happens. And if there are not so many changes, it's quite quick. But sometimes.
So the question was asked by our favorite doctor in chemistry, and so I'm going to ask him on the chat, which is there. That is the chat. In chemistry, did it take also between 2 and 6 months, or did you have to wait longer on it? So while he's writing and answering, I'm still inviting other people to ask questions. Yeah, same for us. He says in chemistry, so it seems to be a normal time for paper submission and acceptance. So are there any other questions from the audience, or are we done? And did I keep my promise of making a 1-hour interview again? Because I'm hungry. I don't know if you are hungry, but maybe you are. So at some point, I would like to eat. It seems that there are no other questions. So I'm gonna say things in English, then things in French, then things again in English. So first of all, I would like to thank you for having accepted the interview, for your time, for your joie de vivre, as the French would say. It was really interesting. I love always. If I could be a professional student, I would be. So it was really interesting. I loved it. I loved it all. Now in French. And so Theo is saying, he's saying thank you and good luck for your last part of your PhD.
Thank you very much.
Ben, je remercie tout le monde d'être là. Je mettrai les choses en replay sur YouTube, sur Spotify, sur Twitch aussi, pour pas que ça disparaisse. Je rappelle à tout le monde que c'est que le début de la fête de la science, et là je me rends compte que j'ai oublié quelque chose de super important, donc c'est pas du tout la fin de l'interview, donc j'annule ce que je viens de dire. I'm cancelling what I just said about this being the end of the interview, because there's one thing I forgot to ask you about, and it's unforgivable, is you've been selected for the Science Fest comic, which is now called Mission Z, which is available on internet. How was that process? This is a bad formatted questions. How did it went? How did it go?
Oh, it was really interesting. I mean, to think about how to put your work, which is kind of very mixed up, confusing. You're not even sure where you are, and you're not even sure how to formulate your own work into a comic book. And then we had to work really heavily with a screenwriter, so with the writer who was writing the script, and then with the visual artist who was drawing the comics. And the questions they would sometimes ask would put you into a circle of self-reflection of, well, what does it really mean? What am I really doing? And because they had to produce a comic book which had to be non-scientific at all, you couldn't use big terms and big kind of words. It had to be very clear and understandable. I think in such cases you need to bring your topic into the fundamental understanding of what is it you do, which is
Okay.
kind of the hardest part.
So
But it was
you were
really
heavily involved in the project. Yeah.
yes. So I mean, in the
Mhm.
beginning, you are. There were, I think, several projects selected. So the writers and the writer and the visual artists had intensive
Mhm.
interviews with all of us after getting familiar with the topic, after reading kind of description of all the projects that all of us do. Then they went into the sessions of interviews trying to understand our not just our PhD topic, but also where does it come from? Are there any personal kind of connections? You know, all of these things. So I would say in the beginning, yes, and then they went into I think 3 months of drawing and drafting and writing,
Okay.
and afterwards, in sometime in June, we had the comic. Unfortunately, there was supposed to be, I think, um, something got discontinued in terms of either the publication or
Hmm.
the big project itself, but then luckily we had some
Yeah, yeah.
copies already.
The project changed
I'm not.
during the making because usually what was done
Mm-hmm.
uh, the other years. Yes. I, Usually, what was done was something like this, called science en bulle, so science in bubbles, and it was not a one continuing story going through the thesis, but it was at the origin each thesis would have
Mm-hmm.
some comic book, but very short. So the particularity for this year is that they made a whole story going through all your thesis. And did you get
Mm-hmm.
to chat with the others? Or do you just know that you are all involved in the same project, but you did not get to talk with one another? Okay,
Not with the others, unfortunately. Just with the writer
okay,
and
okay.
with the illustrator. But we knew,
Mhm.
we knew the topics of each other and the others were doing, but
Okay,
on a
okay.
distance.
And now this is the end. So I'm going to say thank you for your time, for your joie de vivre. Uh, Thank you everybody
Thank you as
in the chat for your questions and your presence. Je rappelle à tout le monde que ceci du coup n'est que le début de la fête de la science pour le Sciencarium. Cette première interview a lieu aujourd'hui, la seconde aura lieu dimanche. Dimanche 5 octobre à 19h, on retrouvera Jade qui, elle, nous parlera d'économie. Donc on s'éloigne beaucoup des thèmes habituels de la science. Hein. On est loin de la physique et de la chimie, l'architecture, l'économie. Après, on fera de l'électronique lundi, et puis mardi, on fera de la psychologie, et ça continuera comme ça toute la semaine, jusqu'à une grosse annonce pour samedi prochain, mais j'en dis pas trop. So there will be a huge announcement in the week for next Saturday. And with this, I formally end this stream. Goodbye everybody. Au revoir à tout le monde. Passez une bonne soirée. Goodbye,
Thank you
goodbye.
very much.